and we will be very appreciative, or you can say no, and we will remember.
Joining us, MS Now reporter Inez de la Catera in Davos, Switzerland, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy Ravi Agrawal, who is also in Davos for us, and AP European security correspondent Emma Burrows in Nuuk, Greenland. All right, so Inez, what has the reaction been post-Donald Trump?
Yeah, Katie, I mean, I think shock, frustration, but we are starting to get some real reaction from the Europeans. So we heard from the Danish foreign minister after the president's speech saying it is positive that the president has ruled out using military force to take Greenland, but also saying that it's clear from the president's speech that the president's ambitions to take Greenland remain intact. We also heard moments ago from the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who is not in Davos, but he said the UK will not be yielding to pressure from the US. He says the UK still has important work to do with the US on things like Greenland, on things like Ukraine, but that doesn't mean that the UK and US need to agree on everything. We're also starting to see the Europeans take concrete action. So we've certainly seen forceful rhetoric from them over the last few days here in Davos. Strong words from the French president, from the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, from the Belgians saying that the EU needs to rearm. But the big question was, would they actually do anything about it? They were mocked by the US Treasury Secretary earlier, questioning whether the Europeans would just write a strongly worded letter. Today, they are showing that they are prepared to take action. You had the European Parliament suspending its work on an EU-US trade deal. We heard from the chair of the Parliament's International Trade Committee, Bernd Lange, who wrote in a statement, given the continued and escalating threats, including tariff threats against Greenland and Denmark and their European allies, we have been left with no alternative but to suspend work on the two Turnberry legislative proposals until the U.S. decides to re-engage on a path of cooperation rather than confrontation. And we're waiting to see whether they take any more reaction. We understand, according to a European official, they are considering measures like the anti-coercion instrument that we understand was initially designed for China. They're potentially considering retaliatory tariffs. So we'll have to wait and see. But we know they are meeting for an emergency summit tomorrow in Brussels.
What is the Turnberry proposal? Does it have anything to do with the Turnberry, the golf course that Donald Trump owns in Scotland?
Lost IFB.
I think we lost Inez's IFB, unfortunately. All right, Ravi, I'll skip ahead to you. You were not in the room. You were in the overflow room with a lot of other folks who couldn't get into the main hall during Donald Trump's speech. I'm wondering what you've been hearing.
Gosh, I mean, a lot of people here just calling it performance art or maybe performative imperialism. This was a stunning speech. I've been to many Davoses over the last 15 years. I have never seen one speech that was this anticipated, with this many hundreds of people trying to get in, because they wanted to see in person Trump repeat the threats that he has made on social media and add some ballast to it. And he did exactly that. And, just for your viewers, you pointed out, Katie, that this was, well over 90 minutes. But for the first 30 or 40 minutes, Trump was scripted. And in most of his scripted remarks, he didn't actually speak about Greenland much. He brought it up later. And ever the showman, he knew that is the only reason why people had come in to listen to him, and the numbers that they did. And of course, he didn't disappoint. The points he made were rambling. He said that NATO has never done anything for the United States, which is absolutely untrue. The only time Article 5 of NATO has been invoked is to defend the United States after 9/11, and Greenland, Denmark, more than any other country, has lost more troops helping Americans than any other country as a percentage of their population. These are facts that everyone in the audience knew about, but they were there to see whether Trump would repeat all of these lies in person and whether he would add some more weight to his threats. He said he wouldn't use force, which is a real relief, I think, and he said as much in his remarks. But the question now is whether European leaders will add some action to their words. And I have to say, I am seeing for the first time in a long time, European leaders really resolve in a strong way to do more than just words, because they realize how serious this now is.
When you're talking about more than just words, do you anticipate, Ravi, that trade, so-called bazooka would be used? We just got from Inez that the Turnberry deal being put on hold, which is, an economic trade deal. But what about a larger package that would actually inflict real pain on Americans?
Well, I think if it doesn't come now with this, it will never come. And I think an array of European leaders now have suggested in public various options. They could take retaliatory tariffs, are one that has been mooted. And we've been asking many European leaders whether they will go ahead with these things, both on stage and off stage, all week here. Nobody has said anything definitive because they wanted to hear from Trump first. Now, Katie, I should point out that it could also be that Trump came here to de-escalate a little bit. And that could be why in his scripted remarks, he didn't actually make any real threats. And it was only afterwards when he spoke unscripted that he veered into a few more of the threats and also the bullying, where he specifically name-called France's president and also Canada's prime minister, saying that he was watching them, he watched their speeches. The ball's now in their court because they've heard what Trump is doing. And I should point out, for everyone who's saying that America has not yet used force or that all these threats are purely hypothetical, tariffs are economic warfare. We know this. And so the United States has already fired an opening salvo. Europe needs to do something if it is to be seen as credible.
Emma, you have been in Nuuk for us, and I'm going to warn everybody that there's a bit of a delay between what I say and what you hear, and so there's going to be a slight pause. But I wonder who there was watching and what their reaction was to Donald Trump taking force off the table, but continuing to demand that he's going to get control.
News as President Trump takes his tough talk on Greenland over to Europe. And Europe is responding. This hour, a major trade deal between the EU and the U.S. is now on ice as European leaders prepare for an emergency meeting. The president arguing today for immediate negotiations over Greenland to begin, saying the U.S. wants, quote, the right, title, and ownership of Greenland, which is, of course, a Danish territory. And moments ago, while seated right next to the head of NATO, President Trump was asked what price he would pay.
Mr. President, do you see a price for Greenland that's reasonable? I could see that, yeah. I could see that. I could see that. But there's a bigger price, and that's the price of safety and security and national security and international security having to do with many of your countries. That's really the price, and that's the big price.
CNN's Elena Trina is live for us at the White House. Elena, several big takeaways here, including the biggest one, the president ruling out military force, though maybe not economic force.
That's right. I think, the president got up there on stage moments after really touching down in Switzerland to deliver this speech to the World Economic Forum. And essentially he said, I am calling on all of our European allies to have immediate negotiations about his desire to have the United States acquire Greenland. That was the word that he used. And so definitely that putting people on edge. But then he did say what he hasn't been saying thus far around this conversation, which is that he is ruling out military intervention. And he repeated that. He essentially took it off the table again when meeting with other foreign leaders later in the day. Listen to how he put it.
We'll see what happens. The military's not on the table. I don't think it'll be necessary. I really don't. I think people are going to use better judgment. They'll use their best judgment, and I don't think that will not be necessary.
So that's somewhat of a relief, I think, to countries like Denmark, of course, which Greenland is part of. But this is still, of course, a concerning conversation and one that isn't going to end with this today. I think a couple things I want to note here, though, from what the president said. He reiterated the reason he believes not only the U.S. Needs Greenland, but he kind of said that it deserves it. He talked about the NATO alliance, arguing that not only the United States, but he personally, he argued, has done more for NATO than any other country. He said because the United States has such a strong military that Greenland would be more secure with the United States having ownership of it, and that Europe would be more secure than any other country. And a lot of what he was saying, Brianna, really gets back to the president's broader foreign policy view, which is very transactional here when it comes to foreign policy. This idea that the United States is kind of owed some of this. He used the same type of rhetoric when talking about tariffs on other countries. All to say, we're going to have to see where this goes and potentially how far the president is really willing willing to go at this point, even if it's not military intervention, what he's willing to do to try and twist the screws with many NATO allies that are very much against this.
Yeah, and how they react to it. Elena Treen, live for us at the White House. Thank you. Erica?
Joining us now, retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmett. General, when we look at all of this, part of what I'm struck by is the way that, and Elena was talking about this a bit, but the way that President Trump is framing this. He is the only, or the United States more broadly, the only ones who could actually defend Greenland. And he went on to say, all we're asking for is to get Greenland, including right, title, and ownership, because, he said, you need the ownership to defend it. You can't defend it on a lease. Do you agree with that? It's impossible to defend on a, quote, lease?
Well, it is impossible to guarantee that we can defend Greenland on the basis of a treaty alone. Treaties can be abrogated. Treaties can be walked away from. Denmark may just say, we don't like the Americans for one reason or another. So there's no question that the indisputable right of ownership would include the ability to ensure that if we put military forces, we put the Golden Dome up there, that it can never be taken away. Now, the probability of Denmark walking away, of Greenland walking away from the treaty, at this point in time, pretty low. 10 years from now, who knows?
Right, who knows? I mean, the reason that there is less of a military installation there now is because it was drawn down by choice by the United States at the end of the Cold War. So Brianna and I were talking earlier today, but also yesterday with Jim Townsend, who helped in those moments with that drawdown, and we were talking about building it back up. It would have to be built back up to some extent. Give us a sense of what's the reality of that? How long would it take, and how quickly would it be effective if that's what the president is after?
Well, it would certainly take a long time if that's going to be included in the Golden Dome. Now, Jim was right. We pulled it down. Part of that was because it was no longer necessary. We had longer range interceptors that could be based in the United States. Our radars were better, could be based in the United States. But if you're talking about the comprehensive ability to ensure that the United States wouldn't be struck out of the blue by the Russians in particular, you're going to need a large infrastructure there and large capability. All you have to do is take a globe at home and turn it on its side, and you can see how instrumental Greenland is between the United States and Russia.
And you can also see why Denmark may not want to hand it over to the United States in that moment. The fact that we keep hearing the president say he's not confident NATO would come to the aid of the United States, when in fact, I mean, this is the one time that Article 5, right, has been invoked, was in the wake of 9/11, when NATO did come to the aid of the United States. It's somewhat...
Let me push back on that. The fact remains is the greatest worry of the Europeans when it comes to Russia is a land-ground invasion coming from the east to the west. They don't have a lot of concern about the Russians coming over Greenland or firing over Greenland. They'd be protected against that. This notion that somehow the Europeans share the same risk with Russia that the Americans do, that is true. But the way that the Russians would accomplish their mission and their goals, attacking Europe versus attacking the United States, are two very, very different things.
So do you agree with the president that this is, in fact, a very real and very urgent matter of national security for the United States that also includes the security of Europe?
Yes.
And to that end, do you think there's another way the president could have gone about this to get Europe on board for more of a U.S. presence?
Look, I'm not going to sit here and argue about style and technique. In the military, we talk about ways, means, and ends. I think we can all agree on the ends. It is a national security imperative, the capability of Russia, and for that matter, China, and to some extent Iran one day, necessitates a relook at Greenland and its focus and its importance to the national security of the United States. I'm not going to sit here and get into the political side or the tactical style points that the president is using. I just know that Greenland is important. We need to make sure it's part of the American national defense structure. I hope we can do this without bruising as many elbows as we've seen so far.
Do you worry about national security and safety if the U.S. were no longer part of NATO?
No.
So the U.S. would be fine without NATO?
NATO would not be fine without the United States.
That was my next question.
the United States is more important to NATO than NATO is to the United States. It's been the finest security arrangement in history. I've served on NATO missions. I've actually worked at NATO, working with Nick Burns, who I see is coming up later. Kosovo, Bosnia, all of those were done much better in the NATO construct.
President Trump articulated a series of grievances centered on his perception that the United States has been systematically taken advantage of by European nations and their leadership. His rhetoric was dominated by complaints about what he viewed as fundamental failures in European governance and policy direction. Most notably, Trump expressed bewilderment and frustration regarding the international response to his aspirations concerning Greenland, seemingly perplexed by the resistance he encountered from Danish officials and other world leaders who opposed his territorial ambitions. The president's tone throughout much of his remarks was combative and accusatory, painting a picture of a continent in decline due to what he characterized as reckless and ideologically driven decision-making at the highest levels of European government. Trump directed considerable vitriol toward European political leaders, castigating them for policies he believed had fundamentally transformed the European continent in ways that rendered it nearly unrecognizable to its historical character. Central to his criticism was what he framed as uncontrolled migration flows into Europe, which he presented as a major threat to European stability and cultural integrity. Beyond immigration concerns, Trump also assailed what he described as radical economic policies emanating from European capitals, suggesting that these ideologically motivated approaches were undermining European prosperity and competitiveness on the global stage. His rhetoric suggested that European leaders had abandoned prudent governance in favor of experimental social and economic experiments that were producing deleterious consequences. Additionally, Trump introduced doubt regarding NATO's foundational commitment to collective defense and its willingness to uphold its treaty obligations to protect American interests. The president questioned aloud whether the alliance could be counted upon to defend the United States in a moment of genuine crisis, raising concerns about the reliability of transatlantic security commitments. Notably absent from his critique was any acknowledgement of a crucial historical fact. The one and only instance in which NATO invoked its collective defense clause under Article 5 was in response to the catastrophic terrorist attacks perpetrated against the United States on September 11, 2001. This omission was particularly striking given that it was American leaders who requested NATO's invocation of collective defense following those attacks, demonstrating the alliance's commitment to American security during a moment of profound vulnerability. Despite the overwhelmingly confrontational and accusatory nature of Trump's remarks, which might have suggested an irreparable rupture in transatlantic relations, European officials and diplomatic observers detected what could be interpreted as a small but meaningful opening for reconciliation. As various world capitals grappled with the prospect of a potentially dramatic shift in American foreign policy and transatlantic relations, this subtle signal of possible détente provided some measure of cautious optimism. In the context of what was clearly a crisis moment for the historically significant relationship between the United States and Europe, even modest indications of willingness to negotiate or find common ground were deemed noteworthy by those invested in preserving transatlantic cooperation and institutional arrangements. The speech produced several significant takeaways that warranted careful analysis by observers of international relations and transatlantic affairs. For European leaders who had been listening with considerable anxiety to Trump's detailed articulation of his position regarding Greenland, a particular phrase stood out amid the otherwise heated and fiery rhetoric that dominated his address. Trump stated explicitly and unambiguously that he would not employ military force to achieve his objectives with respect to Greenland. This declaration represented the clearest and most definitive statement the president had made on this contentious issue up to that point. Prior to his Wednesday remarks at Davos, Trump had deliberately avoided ruling out the use of military force, leaving open the possibility that armed intervention might be contemplated as an option. Additionally, White House officials had previously indicated that military options remained on the table and were not being discounted from consideration, creating an atmosphere of genuine concern among international observers. Trump's explicit renunciation of military force as a means to pursue his Greenland objectives provided significant reassurance to government officials who had been actively preparing for what they anticipated might become extraordinarily tense diplomatic confrontations with the Trump administration. These officials had been developing strategies to navigate and manage potential conflicts that could arise from American attempts to acquire or exert control over Greenland, and they recognized the severity of the situation, understanding that miscalculation could potentially escalate into an actual military conflict. By taking military force off the table, Trump provided substantial relief to these officials and to the broader international diplomatic community. The markets also responded positively to this declaration, as investors and financial institutions reacted favorably to what they perceived as a reduction in geopolitical risk. Markets had experienced significant losses and downward pressure on Tuesday as traders grappled with the uncertainty surrounding Trump's Greenland ambitions and the potential for international conflict. The president's clarification that he would not resort to military means contributed to market sentiment shifting from negative to positive, demonstrating how international investors monitor and respond to signals regarding potential geopolitical conflict. Welcome to an agency where creative ideas meet measurable impact. Let's showcase what makes us your perfect partner in advertising.